Why don't you start, John, with telling everybody who you are, your firm that you work with, and what you guys specialize in?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm John Henson. I'm an attorney at Troutman Amin. We are a firm that basically specializes in TCPA, both litigation and then compliance. I'm on the compliance side. And we have been around the firm's been open for 2 years, but we have decades of experience in this area. So it's kind of all we do. So, try to stay up to date. We're definitely staying up to date on it for sure.
Yeah, especially these days, lots going on.
Yeah, lots going on. We also run TCPAworld.com, which is the leading website for TCPA news. And we update that usually multiple times a day with the news. So we definitely have our finger on the pulse.
That's interesting. I didn't realize you guys updated that often. I know we have a habit of checking it every week to see what's going on. You're
Yeah.
definitely our source for news on all of this. So that's interesting. That's cool. Let's just start from the top and work our way down. So what exactly is the do not call registry, or more commonly known as the DNC list in our industry?
TCPA has two parts, right? They have what we call the regulated technology part, which is talking about auto dialers, pre-recorded messages, things like that. The other part is the do not call portion of the TCPA. And in that do not call portion, there is a regulation that creates a do not call registry that you can go on and you can go put your residential phone number in this do not call registry. And it adds you to the registry. It's commonly called the DNC list, right? So a phone number that is on a DNC list is afforded protection under the TCPA from receiving unwanted calls. It's interesting because it's phone number dependent, not personal, right? So if Drew goes and puts his phone number on there, was 1234, and then Drew gets another phone and it's 5678, but doesn't put 5678 on the list, Drew can get calls at 5678, and that's not a violation of DNC.
So what does that mean for somebody so let's say I've gone and I've registered with the DNC list for my cell phone number, and then I go fill out a web form asking to be contacted for something. Is there a conflict there, or like what trumps in that situation?
So the do not call provisions say you can't call someone on the DNC list unless there's exceptions, right?
Okay.
And then the exceptions are established business relationships, okay, which is a defined term. And then what we call the prior express invitation or permission. Sorry.
Okay.
So I get that one confused because there's also prior express written consent, which we'll talk about in a second. But prior express invitation or permission is a slightly lower standard than prior express written consent. Okay. So how that works is the express invitation or permission is saying, yes, I know this person is going to call me, and I'm okay with that person calling. And there's been actually a lot of cases lately on prior express invitation or permission. And they basically said that if the consumer knows or should know that this person is calling them, that's not a violation of the DNC, right? So there was a case recently where Manhattan Honda went out of business, and they transferred all their lists to Manhattan Lexus, which was owned by the same company but different entity. And Manhattan Lexus's service department would call the Honda customers.
Right.
Well, the court found that they did not have prior express invitation or permission because it wasn't reasonable for a driver of a Honda Civic to get a call from Manhattan Lexus saying, hey, your car's ready for a service, right? So that's what we try to think of. And I try to tell people this a lot, Drew, is when you're creating your consent language or prior express permission language, is the consumer should never be surprised about who's calling them. Now, whether that's, I know that Drew's calling me, or I know that a real estate investor's calling me, an unnamed investor at this time, right? So we really want to make sure that the consumer understands who is going to be making those calls, and that allows the consumer to actually consent to those calls, right? Because that's where you run into trouble is anytime there's a situation where the customer picks up the phone and says, who is this and why are they calling me? That is how every good story starts with, watch this. And every good TCPA lawsuit starts with, who is this and why are they calling me?
It's a great rule of thumb. That's kind of fun.
Yeah.
So, what are the potential consequences of violating the DNC regulations?
Sure. So there are fines for DNC, and they can be very expensive. They can be upwards of $50,000 in certain cases, right? But realistically, the number is 1,500. Okay, but how we get to that 1,500 is the TCPA, where they have a private action, meaning a consumer can sue you, right, as a private action, is $500 per violation, but those will be tripled if you knowingly and willfully violate the statute. How do we prove knowingly and willfully, right? If you are blatantly buying a cold list of numbers and you're just buying these random numbers, right? And you're like, I don't care if they have consent, don't tell me if they have consent, don't, that is a knowing and willful violation, and that is going to could result in $1,500 per call, right? And that is if you call 5 people twice, that's 10 calls, that's $15,000, right? So you can see how we get to big numbers very quickly.
That's regardless of regulated technology, right? Like that, and that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah,
And this doesn't even matter. This is you're on your iPhone. If they're on DNC and you just pulled this list from wherever,
yeah.
those fines apply to you.
The regulated technology piece, people think that I'm not using regulated technology, so TCPA doesn't affect me, right? Well, the regulated technology portion doesn't. Agree, right? But the DNC portion still does. So you still want to make sure that you've got processes and procedures set up to make sure you're not running afoul of those procedures, those policies. Excuse me.
Right. So end of the day, people can register for the DNC list or do not call registry. And so if you pull a list and call them kind of unsolicited, you
Mm-hmm.
can be fined. If they're on the DNC list, but they fill out a web form or give you some form of
Yeah,
yeah, fine for you to contact me, and they're not surprised by the person or the company being calling them, then that kind of makes sense. Or partners of the company calling them,
yeah,
and then that's fine. Okay.
yep.
So what about, and we get this asked a lot, and it'll apply to another question down below as well, but are real estate investors, when offering to buy properties, subject to this DNC list? Because there's a bit of a misconception, I think, right now, where because investors aren't selling anything, that these laws don't apply to them.
That's a great question, and I think that there's some nuances to that. So DNC applies to anyone. But it applies to anyone making a call for a telephone solicitation. Okay. So what's a telephone solicitation? Well, it's defined as an offer to sell something, right? Now, where we see investors get in trouble is a lot of investors are real estate agents. Courts have found an investor, even as saying, hey, I'm really interested in buying your house, and where are you going to move? Right? Well, actually, what you're trying to do there is go sell them a house, right? You're trying to become their agent, right? And that would be a telephone solicitation, because if it's a dual purpose call, right, they're gonna lean to a marketing call
Right.
or telephone solicitation in this instance. So I would say that a real estate investor that is a pure investor and all I want to do is buy your house,
Yeah.
you are at a lower risk of DNC problems.
Would you consider a wholesaler in that as well? Because a wholesaler is trying to obtain the contract and then sell that contract to somebody else. Could it get sticky in that situation?
Absolutely, that becomes a very gray area, right? Because in that case, this is how you know that I am a true nerd, because here it is. Yep. So we'll look at the solicitation, because I think the way it's written is the initiation or phone call or message for the purpose of encouraging the purchase or rental of or investment in property, goods, or services. Okay. So I could argue that that's an investment in, you're the front leg of the investment piece, right? So I would definitely argue that becomes a gray area very quickly.
So this would be for anybody listening. I think that the safe assumption here is like, don't think that that is what's going to keep you safe in this.
Yep.
Like, and
Yep.
you explained this on another call with us, that think of it as like insulation layers, right? Like, yeah, this might be a layer that might keep you protected, but it's certainly not worth like not even thinking about this and going and being a cowboy and just like calling these and thinking that you'll be safe if you ever get caught, to try and argue that you're not selling anything.
it's going to survive a blizzard, right? So you don't necessarily want to go out in your undershirt and underwear, right? You'd like to layer up. We want to layer up that protection against us, right? Relying purely on, oh, well, I'm an investor, therefore it's not a solicitation, so I'm fine. That's going out there.
So what then is the TCPA?
So the TCPA is the overarching law, right, that the DNC lives under. A DNC violation is a TCPA violation. A lot of TCPA lawsuits, right, are really just DNC lawsuits.
Then what is regulated technology? I think would be a good.
Yep. So regulated technology is an automatic telephone dialing system or artificial voice message or pre-recorded voice message. Those collectively are called, what do we call the regulated technology? Okay. So an ATDS, that's a very loaded topic and it's an hour-long conversation, but I always tell people to think of it as a spectrum, right?
Right.
So on one end of the spectrum, you have me pecking your number out on my cell phone, right? And dialing. On the other side of the spectrum is a system that is randomly generating phone numbers and just power dialing through them, right? So that is clearly, I mean, I think we would all agree that's an automatic telephone dialing system, right? And on my side, we would all agree that's not. That's me calling people manually, single on my phone, right? Everything else lives in a spectrum therein, right? So the closer we get to the me hunting and pecking on a phone, the better. The closer you get to a random number generating power dialer, I don't want to say the worst because it's not bad. It's just the riskier that becomes if you don't have prior express written consent.
Right.
And the reason I point that out is because if you're doing a marketing call and using regulated technology, then you have to have prior express written consent.
This is what's happening 127, or this is what's current now?
That's current now. So what's happening in January is we're changing the definition of prior express written consent, okay, to include the phrase you have to identify one seller at a time. A couple of things we're going to dig in there. One is currently, right? You see on a lot of lead gen sites, it'll say, I give permission to website and its partners, and that partner is a hyperlink to a list of 2,000 names, right?
Yep.
Currently, that's okay. It's not great, but it's okay. It's probably going to offer you some bit of protection. But because in January, we're changing the definition of prior express written consent to include that single seller at a time, that's no longer viable, right? So we would want to say, I consent to website, partner A, partner B, partner C. And the consumer has to check who those are, right? Who they want to hear from, right?
Right.
You can't force it. The consumer has to make that decision.
And just to map it in our specific example, currently our website would say, you fill out this form to get a cash offer from Leadzolo, one of our partners.
Yep.
And so you're saying on the 27th of January, that's going to need to say you're giving written consent for Leadzolo's partner, Residi LLC, to be the person I'm selling the lead to call. And they need that specific one-to-one written consent to use the regulated technology.
Yes. And I'm glad you framed it that way, Drew, because we're only changing the definition of prior express written consent. Mm-hmm. And prior express written consent only applies to telemarketing calls using regulated technology. Mm-hmm. If we're not using regulated technology, then you don't need the one-to-one consent.
Right. And that's where the DNC that we started with came from, where like a web form lead, you can still use and call, but you got to use an iPhone if the disclaimer on the bottom of that form said, I'm giving Leadzolo and a Leadzolo partner consent to contact me. Basically, that's just saying you're not protected from DNC, but you are not protected from this regulated technology situation now, or the updated one-to-one consent.
Correct. 100%. Yep. So now the good news is, I would imagine the majority of your investors, right, aren't necessarily using regulated technology. So that's the good news. But we still have that DNC problem to think about, right? The other issue is there are definitely some large scale investors who would be using something that could be considered regulated technology. So therefore, they still want that prior express written consent, right, to be fully protected.
We were talking before that like regulated technology is like to be as safe as you can be. You need to stay away from a software that even has the capability of being an auto dialer or whatever, or for all intents and purposes. So, for example, Go High Level could technically be regulated tech because it has the capacity to dial through a list of numbers. So, if you're using Go High Level, even just to text or call manually, you could still be found liable under this.
Yeah, and we have found courts that have said the package you own or the package you're using from your software service provider has this capability. Okay,
Mm.
even if you're not using it, you still have that capability. Now they've also said 5.9. If you're using this portion of 5.9, it's not. This package is not an auto dialer. This package is. I like to say, the bronze package isn't, but the gold package that encompasses the bronze package is. So if you're in the gold package, but you're only using the bronze features, you're still at risk, right?
Yeah, so I would think anybody listening should think about that because I know a lot of people using different CRMs, and the more I think about it, I would think most CRMs would probably fall under regulated technology.
Yeah. Definitely, at least potentially, right? I mean, I think all the big CRMs out there could definitely fall under it because they all probably have the capacity to in some
Yeah.
configuration, right? So I always like to tell people that, like, let's assume you are and work backwards from there, right?
So what I think we've said it in pieces, but to put it together, so what are the different types of consent? Like there's express written consent and there's verbal consent, which I think falls under the definition you were using earlier. So what different types are there, I
Yeah,
suppose?
that's a great question. So there's three. Okay, generally speaking, there's three. There is prior express consent. That is verbal consent. Prior express consent can be used for informational calls. Informational is not telemarketing. And telemarketing, as we talked about earlier, requires prior express written consent. How would you ever get prior express consent? Well, you can get it over the phone. An informational call, right? There are lots of courts have found that the continuation of a transaction is not a telemarketing call. So think about it this way: I'm interested in buying your house, and let's just, for argument purposes, say that's, if I called you and said, "Hey, I want to buy your house," that's a telemarketing call. Okay.
Yep.
Now you call me, you initiate the call and say, "Hey, I see you're buying houses. I'd like to learn more." Okay, great. We talk and you say, "I really want to finish this conversation, but can you call me back this afternoon at 5 o'clock?" Right? And I say, "Yes, I can." When I call you back at 5 o'clock, right? That is a continuation of the transaction that you initiated, right? So in that case, your verbal consent for me to call you on that phone number is prior express consent, okay?
Right.
Which allows me to call you back. So I solved my DNC problem, but I
Mhm.
also solved, if I was using regulated technology, right? I could call you back on a regulated technology
Verbal is enough to call back unregulated?
for an informational call.
Informational, right. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which is
Continuation.
yeah, it's basically two flavors. Informational calls are basically two flavors. It's like, hey, it's a continuation of a call, of a call, right, of a transaction,
Mhm.
or it's, hey, Drew, your prescriptions are ready,
Right.
right? That's the perfect informational call. It's not trying to sell you anything. It's trying to tell you something. I mean, sell versus tell. So that's prior express consent. Prior express written consent is required for telemarketing calls.
Mm.
Okay, so that's what we talked about using regulated technology. Okay, so we talked about that one, and then the third we talked about earlier, which is prior express invitation or permission. Again,
Yeah.
slightly lower than prior express written consent. Okay, but it also requires writing. The fourth kind of flavor of consent, it's not really consent. It is an exemption to DNC that we only briefly touched on earlier, and that's established business relationship. So the established business relationship comes into effect on either a purchase of a product, and if it's based off a purchase of a product, you have an 18-month window, assuming the consumer doesn't revoke their consent anytime soon. But you have an
Right.
18-month window to continue to call that person from a DNC perspective. From an inquiry into a product or service, you have 90 days to contact that person based off an inquiry under DNC. Okay. So what does that mean? Someone comes on your website and says, "Hey, I want to learn more." Okay. And you call them back, not using regulated technology. Okay, let's throw that away. That's a different beast. And you're like, great, I can call this person back and say, Drew, you filled out a form on my website. Love to talk to you more about buying your house. That is a inquiry based established business relationship. Okay, it's a voluntary two-way transaction. Okay, in which the consumer has reached out and said, raised their hand basically and said, I'm interested. I want to learn more. Okay. So from a DNC perspective, that helps investors as well. Right. So again, we're going back to what we talked about, the layers, right? We got that base layer of me straight up buying your house is not a telephone solicitation. Okay.
Mhm.
But even if it is, I've got an inquiry based relationship with this consumer. Okay. And even if it's not an inquiry based relationship, I've got something in writing from them, right? To establish a prior express invitation or permission. And even if that's not right, I have prior express written consent from them, right? So when we think about, and you and I have had this conversation, when we think about consent language on a form, okay,
Mhm.
we're layering all that in. We have as much defense as possible to TCPA violation claims, right? Because let's work, if we work at it backwards, right? We're going to say, you called me and you shouldn't have. I had prior express written consent. No, you didn't, because you didn't have a checkbox or whatever. Okay, fine. But I still had prior express invitation and permission. No, you didn't, because it wasn't in writing. Okay, great, fine. But you gave me your phone number and you called me. That's a inquiry for an established business relationship. And you're like, all right, crap, you win, right? So like we just that's kind of how we think about it, is creating those multiple layers of defense and
Yeah.
of risk mitigation for clients.
To separate the two specifically for investors,
Mm-hmm.
um, if we're looking at, I'm an investor, I do not use regulated technology. Basically, I just need to make sure that the leads I'm getting have opted in to be contacted in one form or
Yep.
another. It
Yep.
doesn't necessarily have to be one-to-one consent, but it is a form of consent for inquiry or as you were saying,
Yeah.
anything like that. And again, this is assuming that we're classifying investors under telemarketing. Uh,
Yep.
but we do have an extra little bit of a layer down there. But next step would be, I'm using regulated technology. I need to make sure the leads I'm calling are giving one-to-one written consent. Now, if we're buying from a PPL company, that takes a little bit of work, like we were talking about, dynamically updating the form with the actual company name in it. If you're running your own marketing, really your name's on your landing page, and as long as you have consent box and the proper disclaimers, you're probably pretty well covered there. That seems pretty clear for inbound lead generation. So what is the difference between that and cold calling? Like, and I know this is probably a big conversation, but like, how do you see this new regulation impacting cold calling, and what do you see cold calling being in 2025?
When I say cold calling, I generally think I'm going to go buy a list. I'm going to buy a list of people in Birmingham, Alabama, who have owned their home for 7 years. Okay,
Right.
because that's when most people move. So I'm going to just call those people, and I go to a Zoom info or data gathering place, put in my criteria, and now I've got a list, and I'm going to call that list. It's incredibly risky. Even
What?
not using regulated technology, it's risky because the only thing you're relying on is, well, I'm just trying to buy your house, right?
Right.
I'm not doing anything else. Again, so if you're a bird dog, that's going to be, like we talked about earlier, it's going to be kind of hard, right?
Yep.
You've added an additional layer of risk. As we talked about briefly, real estate agents who are trying to say, I want to buy your house and or sell your house, right? Additional layer of risk. You have to personally make some risk tolerance decisions, right? Am I willing to take that risk? Am I not?
Do you think these regulations are targeting cold calling? And like, do you think that, in the next 5 to 10 years, like it'll get harder and harder specifically for this? I always wonder, is this what the main purpose of this is for? Is to get rid of all this spam and texting and all this other stuff and just forcing people to not have to deal with unsolicited communication as a whole?
It's clear to me reading the FCC's language that they want to stop robocalls. Helpfully, they've never defined robocalls. Um, but I think the general consensus is auto power dialers. I'm going to go ring 10 phone numbers at once. And if somebody picks up, there'll be a click and then I'll talk to them. That's what they're trying to stop. Okay. The problem is it is an inartfully written statute that encompasses significantly more.
Right.
Right. That's the problem. And I do think that the old traditional smile and dial cold call, it's backhatch, right? Regulatory backhatch is what I like to call it. Right. So backhatch is what you get when you're going tuna fishing and you get a dolphin in there. Right. You don't mean to get the dolphin, they're just there. Old school cold calling is regulatory backhatch.
If I am cold calling personally, I'm a new investor and I'm just getting started and I've learned about cold calling, you're probably safe to go to PropStream or Batch Leads or Zoom Info, pull a list, scrub it against the DNC, and pick up your iPhone and call. Now, your exposure is that really the only layer of insulation you have here is that you're not selling anything. So it could get sticky. The other side of that is you're a seasoned vet and you're doing cold calling at volume and you're using regulated tech. Every number that you're calling needs to have one-to-one consent through that regulated technology.
Yeah.
That's where life is super tough. Interesting.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's, if I'm going to be very candid with you, I don't know how you can safely cold call a bought list using regulated technology. Like you are asking for problems.
Yeah.
Now, to your actual example, and you actually mentioned something that I didn't, but you're incredibly correct. Like if you're going to scrub against the DNC, you've taken that risk way down. It's the not scrubbing against the DNC list that's the problem.
And for non-reg tech.
Yeah, like, for non-reg.
Yeah. And you even mentioned too, and this is kind of a little off the cuff, not related, but there's even like a litigations list that you can add against as well. And they're like literally people that have taken somebody to court for cold calling them, but maybe not on the DNC list. So it's just kind of an extra list to scrub against.
It's generally it's what we call multiple time litigators, right? Also known as professional litigators, right? And it's people that have been plaintiffs in multiple TCPA lawsuits. There's more of those people than you would actually
think. Not being in the lead gen business. pretty good idea.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So what would your blanket suggestion be to investors who are buying from PPL companies, knowing, and like just to map it out so it is completely clear, when an investor is buying from a pay-per-lead company, that pay-per-lead company, in my case, Leadzolo, we have different brands that we're advertising on to bring leads into our funnel to distribute to the investors. So the investors actually don't even know the brand of the ads or web pages that the leads are coming from. So just to kind of like set the table with that, what does an investor need to know or should expect from a PPL company before buying leads from them and to keep themselves safe and to insulate their business?
I always tell people that you have to know where your leads are coming from. So if I'm going to go to Leadzolo and you're going to tell me, hey, I've got lots of brands, right? And I drive traffic from these 50 sites. I can't right now tell you where I'm going to drive your traffic from, right? But here's our typical experience, right? If you can get, if you're going to go buy from a PPL company and they can't tell you, oh, well, I can't really show you a typical experience, like that's problematic, right? Because they should either be able to tell you, I'm driving 100% of my own traffic from these 50 websites, right? Or I can't show you the experience because I'm driving traffic from a lot of places and it's moving all the time. Like that's a red flag, right? Because they could be driving incentivized traffic. They could be driving co-reg traffic. That's not what you're looking for. They could just be buying cold call list. So like, even if you say as an investor, I don't want to buy cold call list, right? So I'm going to go buy PPL. But they can't, but their partner can't tell you where they're getting their leads from. You have no way to know they're not just buying cold call lists and then say, oh, here you go. Here's some leads, right? I always like to understand what is the lead journey for that consumer. I somewhat jokingly say that like compliance is fairly easy. You just tell the consumer what you're going to do and then you do it. And that's somewhat true for TCPA compliance too, right? Like if the consumer has come through a form and it says, we have people who want to buy your house. We have people who want to buy your house. We have people who want to buy your house. I call them and I say, I want to buy your house. That consumer knows what's happening, right? That's a good consumer that is in the transaction and understands what's going on. Again, much like we talked about at the very beginning of like, you want to avoid the who is this person? Why are they calling me? I've signed up to do a survey. I now enter a contest. I signed up for V-Bucks cards for my Fortnite
Yeah.
game. I'd like to buy your house. That is a disconnect that is going to cause you problems in the future, which is why we always tell people you have to know where those leads are coming from and what the customer path looks like. Now, is it reasonable to say, hey, I drive through these 50 forms and they're all different colors, but they're all the same version of, this? Yes, that's 100% reasonable, right? But it's not reasonable to be able for your lead source, not to be able to tell you what a typical customer experience is.
Right. Like they should be able to show you the experience and even indicate like this is a one-to-one consent or this is like a web form. How would you verbalize the not one-to-one consent type lead where it's like Leadzolo and its partners? So like you could use
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, I would say this is one-to-one consent, or this person has given consent, but
Mhm.
it may not be prior express written consent.
Right. So your lead
Right.
provider should be able to provide at least what that is and or be able
Yeah.
to separate those two so that you know if you can use regulated technology or not to call them.
Like we have lots of clients that have said they have, two different contracts, right? They have a contract for leads that are going to get prior express written consent, and they have contracts for leads that don't. And the leads that don't say, hey, lead buyer, that I'm not giving you prior express written consent for these. So if you want to use regulated technology, you better get consent on your own. And that's a reasonable way to do it, right? Because it's like everything else. There's a difference of value there, right? If I know that Leadzolo has gotten prior express written consent, yeah, it makes more sense that they're going to charge me more than something that doesn't have prior express written consent, and I'm responsible for getting it myself, right?
What about anybody who has the idea that as an investor, I can just pass on the liability? If I went and bought this lead from a PPL company and the person is on whatever, I use RegTech and they didn't have one-to-one consent and now they're trying to sue me. Well, can't I just pass that on to the PPL company and go, well, you guys generated the lead? So where's the liability lie in that chain?
If they're telling you that they've gotten prior express written consent and that they're going to indemnify you for it, then yeah, you can go back and pass it, right?
Right.
But you know this. I look at a lot of lead provider contracts.
Yeah.
Not a lot of them say that, right?
Really?
Yeah. So some do. I mean, there's a good bit to do, but some say, I'm not telling you I got prior express written consent. I'm telling you that these are leads I generated, but I'm not telling you that this is consent. They're going to have the right consent for you to do regulated technology.
And so as the investor buying the lead, that is on you. If you go use regular technology, that's your butt that's
It's
on
on
fire.
you. Yep. Going back to knowing who your lead providers are. Like, look, I'm a lawyer. You should always have a contract, right? But I know how this works. I'm also not dumb. But don't go sign up for something that's going to cause you risk and not have some sort of contract around who's going to handle that risk. Because if you don't have a contract, guess who's handling that risk? You.
Is there anything that we may not have covered, or is there any surprises coming at the end of January that you think we're not talking about or should be talking about?
No, I think that we've had a lot of questions lately about the election,
Mhm.
right? And what does a change of administration mean?
I read your post on that a week ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it means a lot. I think that the one-to-one consent is going to go into effect. If for no other reason, then it's supposed to go into effect on the 27th. The administration doesn't take root until the 20th. And this doesn't feel like a first week priority for this administration. So, and I also say the big caveat to that is unless this administration comes in and says, we're not doing any new rules in any agency for the next 6 months until we understand what's going on.
Yeah.
I think there's probably a non-zero chance that happens. You're talking 5-10%.
And on a law and a regulation that makes sense anyways. Like
Yeah.
So be whatever the administration might be trying to do. At the end of the day, what this regulation is trying to prevent is people getting harassed. So
Yep.
any administration is not just going to like, whoop, don't need that. Uh,
Yeah.
it might get pushed back or whatever, but I imagine it's going to be coming regardless.
Yep.
Well, I greatly appreciate this. This was awesome. For anybody who watches this and they want to reach out to you for more information, where's the best place to find you?
Yeah. You can find me at Henson at troutmanamin.com is my email address. Feel free to email me. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there, so feel free to reach out there. If you're interested in this or you just kind of want to understand it, like I said, come follow tcpaworld.com. You can get an email every time we send a new article out, so you can stay up to date on that. Eric recently put out a post, called TCPA 101, essentially, and it kind of just lays it all out. That was his post from today, but obviously, I don't know when you're watching this, but it's going to be recent, so it'll be on there.
Right. We'll link to it when we send this out to
Yeah,
the.
awesome.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. I greatly
All right,
appreciate this. A ton of value.
no problem, Drew. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Talk
Let me
soon.
know if I can help anymore. Thanks.